What was considered scripture at the time of Jesus? The written scripture was clearly a major part of the first century church, even before the Gospels and Paul's epistles were written. Most scholars agree that the book of Galatians is probably our first apostolic scripture actually penned, and that Paul probably didn't have copies of the gospel books while he was writing any of his letters. And yet, throughout his writings, we see the scriptures being referenced repeatedly. Like in 1 Corinthians 10, when speaking about the Exodus from Egypt, he says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instructions." Or in Romans 15, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instructions." And 1 Timothy 4, "Give attention to the public reading of scripture." And 2 Timothy, "To be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth." And everyone's favorite, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, "All scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work." This language is found throughout all of our first century writings. Like in Acts 17, we see that Paul reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead. We see the Bereans in Acts 17:11, who received Paul's words with great eagerness and examined the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. In Acts 18, we see now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. But again, what was he mighty in? They didn't have copies of the Gospels or Paul's letters. What were they referring to every time they mentioned the scriptures or what was written? They were all talking about the Hebrew Bible, or what many people today call the Old Testament. As you may have already noticed here at Bible class, we don't really love the words Old Testament and New Testament because we think they don't give the right connotation to us as followers of Jesus. When we say something is old, we tend to think of it as not as good or done away with. And we say something is new, we tend to think of it as better or a replacement for something else. But neither of those ideas are what the Bible wants us to understand it to be. We like to use the language of Hebrew Bible for the Old Testament and apostolic scriptures for the New, acknowledging that the apostles, the ones sent out by Jesus, were divinely inspired to write their gospels and their epistles, hence apostolic scriptures. We need to recognize that every time the apostolic scriptures mention the scriptures or the words of truth, they're referring back to the Hebrew Bible. So when they're writing and telling everyone that all scripture is inspired by God, they're referring to the Torah, to the books of history, to the prophets, the Psalms, the Proverbs. Those are the books that were around in the days of Paul in the first century. And as Jesus himself says, it is those very scripture that testify about me.